Hello everyone and welcome back to The Lost Planeswalker. You're here with me, Jesse, the Lost Planeswalker, and today I have the final video of our Lost Caverns of Ixalan Commander deck series. And this one is probably my favorite one, Xavier Sal Infested Captain. Xavier Sal is a really cool commander that has some really cool ways you can build around him. And just so you all know, the way I decided to build around was Proliferate, specifically +1/+1 counter Proliferate, because with Proliferate, there's so many strategies you can kind of go along with that I wanted to get that out there. The populate side of it, I didn't really do as much with because I think if you're going to be focusing on one, you really got to go hard into it, unless you're just building a more casual deck. But in the future, I will be building this as a populate deck, so keep that in mind. But Xavier Sal Infested Captain is black, green, blue, legendary creature, human, fungus, pirate. You can tap to remove a counter from another permanent you control to populate, activate only as a sorcery, and you can tap to sack another creature to proliferate, activate only as a sorcery. So this is a really unique card that kind of gives you two build paths, and I think the main reason I didn't choose populate is because populate has a major connection to white cards, and the fact that they didn't make this white really kind of bummed me out. I understand it's a pirate, it gets blue, but it's a fungus, so I wanted the white for Abzan, and I was like, this is going to be a perfect card. But, you know, you get what you get. So, this is a cool card. I'm sure there's a million cool ways to build around this, especially with Proliferate and Populate. So, let's dive in and see what those basic lands I chose are. I'm going to keep it real simple. I just chose forests, islands, and swamps. I didn't want to waste your time. So, let's look directly next into cards that place counters on things that we care about, placing counters that we can then proliferate. So, starting off, we have Arwen, Weaver of Hope, Benevolent Hydra, and Champion of Lamholt. Arwen, Weaver of Hope says each other creature you control enters the battlefield with a number of additional +1/+1 counters equal to Arwen, Weaver of Hope's toughness, which is great because everything that enters just gets a number of +1s equal to its power, which is actually pretty insane. Benevolent Hydra is a Hydra that enters with X +1/+1 counters on it. If one or more +1/+1s will be put on another creature you control, that many +1 are put on instead. And X, remove a +1/+1 from Benevolent Hydra and put a +1/+1 counter on another target creature you control, meaning you're actually putting 2 on because of its ability. And Champion of Lamholt, probably one of the best cards ever printed for any +1/+1 strategy deck. Creatures with power less than Champion of Lamholt's power can't block creatures you control, just creatures in general. Whenever another creature enters a battlefield under your control, put a +1/+1 counter on Champion of Lamholt. Next up is Court of Garenberg, Death's Presence, and Experimental Cards. Court of Garenberg is an enchantment that says when it enters, you become the monarch. At the beginning of your upkeep, distribute 2 +1/+1 counters among 2 target creatures. Then, if you're the monarch, double the number of +1/+1 counters on each creature you control. Death's Presence says whenever a creature you control dies, put X +1/+1 counters on target creature you control, where X is the power of a creature that died. And Experimental Card says it has all activated abilities of each other creature with a +1/+1 counter on it, and you can tap to put a +1/+1 counter on a target creature. Next up, we have Fathom Mage, Fertilid, and Forgotten Ancient. Fathom Mage, one of my favorite cards because it has the evolve mechanic, meaning if you play something that either has a bigger power or toughness, it gets a +1/+1 counter on it. Then whenever a +1/+1 counter is put on Fathom Mage, you can draw a card. Fertilid says when it enters battlefield, put 2 +1/+1 counters on it, and then you can remove one to go search for a basic land, which we can just pump a bunch onto it and then just be able to search for a lot of basics out of our deck very easily. And Forgotten Ancient says whenever a player casts a spell, you may put a +1/+1 counter on Forgotten Ancient. At the beginning of your upkeep, you may move any number of +1/+1 counters from Forgotten Ancient onto other creatures. Gutter Grime, Gyre Sage, and Mana Gorger Hydra are next. Gutter Grime is an enchantment that says whenever a non-token creature you control dies, put a slime counter on Gutter Grime. Then put a green ooze creature token onto the battlefield with this creature's power and toughness are equal to the number of slime counters on Gutter Grime. Gyre Sage has evolve as well, and add 1 green mana for each +1/+1 counter on Gyre Sage. And Mana Gorger Hydra has trample, and whenever a player casts a spell, put a +1/+1 counter on Mana Gorger Hydra. Master Biomancer, Ochre Jelly, and Oran Reef Ooze are next. Master Biomancer has each other creature you control enters the battlefield with a number of additional +1/+1 counters on it equal to Master Biomancer's power, and as a mutant in addition to its other types. Very, very similar to Arwen, where we're just going to be able to put a ton of counters just for entering the battlefield. Ochre Jelly has trample and enters the battlefield with X +1/+1 counters on it. Split. When Ochre Jelly dies, if it had 2 or more +1/+1 counters on it, create a token that's a copy of it at the beginning of the next end step. The token enters the battlefield with half the number of +1/+1 counters on it rounded down. And Oran Reef Ooze says when Oran Reef Ooze enters the battlefield, put a +1/+1 counter on a target creature you control. When Oran Reef Ooze attacks, attacks, put a +1/+1 counter on each attacking creature with a +1/+1 counter on it. Ozolith, the Shattered Spire, Plaxcaster Frogling, and Predator Ooze are next. In the Ozolith, the Shattered Spire is a legendary artifact with if one or more +1/+1 counters would be put on an artifact or creature you control, that many +1/+1 counters are put on it instead. 1 in a green, tap, put a +1/+1 counter on target artifact or creature you control, activate only as a sorcery, or you can just cycle it for 2. Plexcaster Frogling is a creature frog mutant with Graft 3. This creature enters the battlefield with 3 +1/+1 counters on it. Whenever another creature enters the battlefield, you may move a +1/+1 counter onto that creature. And 2, target creature with a +1/+1 counter on it gains Shroud until end of turn to help protect some of our stuff. And Predator Ooze is an indestructible ooze with whenever Predator Ooze attacks, put a +1/+1 counter on it, and whenever a creature dealt damage by Predator Ooze this turn dies, put a +1/+1 counter on Predator Ooze. Rishkar Pima Renegade, Scavenging Ooze, and Simic Ascendancy are next. Rishkar Pima Renegade is a legendary elf druid with when Rishkar enters the battlefield, put a +1/+1 counter on each of up to 2 target creatures, and then each creature you control with a counter on it has tapped to add a green. Scavenging Ooze says, green, exile target card from a graveyard. If it was a creature card, put a +1/+1 counter on Scavenging Ooze and you gain 1 life. And Simic Ascendancy is an enchantment with 1 green, blue, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. Whenever 1 or more +1/+1 counters are put on a creature you control, put that many growth counters on Simic Ascendancy. At the beginning of your upkeep, if Simic Ascendancy has 20 or more growth counters on it, you win the game. Slurk All Ingesting, the Goose Mother, and the Great Henge are next. Slurk All Ingesting says, it enters the battlefield with 5 +1/+1 counters on it. When Slurk or another creature you control dies, if it had +1/+1 counters on it, put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control that has a +1/+1 counter on it. The Goose Mother is a flying creature with the Goose Mother enters the battlefield with X +1/+1 counters on it. When the Goose Mother enters the battlefield, create half X food tokens rounded up, and whenever the Goose Mother attacks, you may sack a food. If you do, draw a card. And the Great Henge says this spell costs X less to cast, where X is the greatest power among creatures you control, which will probably be more than 7, so it'll usually just cost green. Then you can immediately tap it to add green and gain 2 life. And whenever a non-token creature enters the battlefield under your control, put a +1/+1 counter on it and draw a card. And last but not least, we have Tribute to the World Tree, which is an enchantment that says whenever a creature enters the battlefield under your control, draw a card. If its power is 3 or greater, otherwise put 2 +1/+1 counters on it. And before we dive into cards that care about you having +1/+1 counters, I just want to say, if you aren't subscribed to my channel, please do so. This is the final video in the series, meaning if you haven't watched any of the other ones yet, please check it out. I built 1 commander deck for every day this week. It was a really fun video decision. It took a lot of time, so if you would just check those out, it would really mean a lot to me. So now, let's look at some cards that care about counters being placed. Starting off, we have Branching Evolution, Bred for the Hunt, and Corpse Jack Menace. Branching Evolution is an enchantment that says if 1 or more +1/+1 counters will be put on a creature you control, twice that many +1/+1 counters are put on that creature instead. Bred for the Hunt is an enchantment that says whenever a creature you control with a +1/+1 counter on it deals combat damage to a player, you can draw a card. And Corpse Jack Menace says if 1 or more +1/+1 counters would be put on a creature you control, twice that many +1/+1 counters are put on it instead. Evolution Sage, Hardening Scales, and Herald of the Secret Stream is next, with Evolution Sage saying whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, proliferate. Really cool effect. Being able to just buff up all those counters is a great effect. And Hardening Scales, again, one of the best single mana enchantments I think ever printed. If 1 or more +1/+1 counters will be put on a creature you control, that +1 are put on it instead. This effect you've seen over and over again in this deck, but Hardening Scales is probably the best version of it, just for how cheap it is. It is very great. And Herald of the Secret Stream says creatures you control with a +1/+1 counter on them can't block, which is super threatening. If you have a giant board of really big creatures, it's a great card to just win you the game. Incubation Druid, Inspiring Call, and Kami of Whispered Hopes is next. And Incubation Druid says add 1 mana of any type that a land you control could produce. If Incubation Druid has a +1/+1 counter on it, add 3 mana of that type instead. You can also adapt for 5 mana to put 3 +1/+1 counters on it, but there's so many other ways to do that in this deck that you really don't need to do so. Inspiring Call is an instant that says draw a card for each creature you control with a +1/+1 counter on it. Those creatures gain indestructible until end of turn. And Kami of Whispered Hopes says if 1 or more +1/+1 counters will be put on a permanent you control, that many +1/+1 counters are put on that permanent instead. And we can tap X mana of any one color, where X is Kami of Hopes power. So if we can buff this up, we can get a ton of mana off it as well. Next up, we have the Ozolith, Unnatural Restoration, and Vorel of the Hullclad. The Ozolith is one of the best legendary artifacts ever printed. It is a single mana and says whenever a creature you control leaves the battlefield, if it had counters on it, put those counters on the Ozolith. At the beginning of combat on your turn, if the Ozolith has counters on it, you may move all counters from the Ozolith onto target creature. Unnatural Restoration lets you return a permanent card from your graveyard to your hand, and then you get to proliferate. And Vorel of the Hullclad is a legendary creature that for a green and a blue doubles the number of each kind of counter on target artifact, creature, or land. Talking about doubling, we also have Vorinclex Monstrous Raider and Winding Constrictor. Vorinclex Monstrous Raider says, Trample Haste. If you would put one or more counters on a permanent or player, put twice that many of each kind of counter on that permanent or player instead. If an opponent would put one or more counters on a permanent or player, they put half that many of each kind of those counters of that permanent or player instead, rounded down. And last, we have Winding Constrictor, a snake that says if one or more counters will be placed on an artifact or creature you control, that many of those counters plus one are placed on that permanent instead. And if you would get one or more counters, you get that many counters plus one instead. And now all that's left is the good stuff. As always, this is things that help us fill out the deck, help us, do some other things that maybe these cards don't do, like card draw or countering or, getting more lands and ramping. So starting out, we have Arcane Signet, Assassin's Trophy, and Beast Within. This is a 3-color deck, so Arcane Signet is going to be an excellent card, letting us add 1 mana of any color in our commander's color identity. Assassin's Trophy lets us destroy a target permanent an opponent controls, and then they may search for a basic and put it onto the battlefield. And Beast Within lets us destroy any target permanent, and whoever controlled that permanent gets a 3/3 beast creature token. Bident of Thassa, Chromatic Lantern, Command Sphere are next. Bident of Thassa says whenever a creature controlled deals combat damage to a player, draw a card. And for 1 and a blue, creatures your opponents control attack this turn if able, forcing our opponents to attack. Maybe they have a small board and we have a really big board. Well, they're just going to come right into us and we get to destroy all their things. Chromatic Lantern says lands you control have tap to add 1 mana of any color, and in addition, we can also tap Chromatic Lantern to add 1 mana of any color. Commander Sphere similarly lets us tap to add 1 mana of any color in our commander's color identity, or we can sack it to draw a card. Counterspell, Cultivate, and Dimir Signet are next, with Counterspell letting us counter a spell. Cultivate lets us search for 2 basics, put 1 on the battlefield and 1 in our hand. And Dimir Signet lets us pay 1 generic to get a blue and a black. Similarly, we have Golgari Signet, Growth Spiral, and Heroic Intervention. And Golgari Signet lets us pay a generic to get a black and a green. Growth Spiral is an instant that lets us draw a card, and we can put an additional land from our hand onto the battlefield. And Heroic Intervention gives our permanents hexproof and indestructible until end of turn. Kodama's Reach, Muldrotha the Gravetide, and Nature's Lore is next. Kodama's Reach works just like Cultivate. We get to go search for 2 basic lands, put 1 on the battlefield tapped and the other into our hand. In Muldrotha, you just gotta put it in any deck that can play black, green, and blue, or Sultai, because it's just so powerful. During each of your turns, you can play a land and cast a permanent spell of each permanent type from your graveyard. So, artifact, enchantment, creature, battle, planeswalker, and lands, it's so good. It's gonna be good in any deck, especially this deck. In Nature's Lore lets you search for forest, put on the battlefield, and then shuffle. Next up is Putrefy, Rampant Growth, and Simic Signet. Putrefy lets us destroy target artifact or creature, and it can't be regenerated. Rampant Growth lets us search for a basic and put on the battlefield tapped. And Simic Signet is 1 mana, tap, add green or blue. Moving into the last couple cards, we have Soul Ring, Sultai Charm, and 1000-Year Elixir. Soul Ring only costs 1 mana, but taps to add 2 mana. Sultai Charm lets us either destroy target multicolored creature, destroy target artifact or enchantment, or draw 2 cards and discard a card. And 1000-Year Elixir lets us activate our commander the turn he enters, and we can pay 1 to untap him to activate him again. Double proliferating every turn would be incredibly strong. And lastly, we have 3 visits, Void Slime and Volrath the Shape Stealer. 3 visits lets us search for a forest, put on the battlefield, then shuffle. Void Slime is a really cool counter spell that costs green, blue, blue, and lets us counter either a target spell, activated ability, or triggered ability, which there aren't a lot of cards that do that, so this flexibility is definitely worth paying an extra green for. And Volrath the Shape Stealer is 2 black, green, and a blue that at the beginning of combat on your turn, you can put a -1/-1 counter on up to 1 target creature. So we can put that on our opponent's stuff and then proliferate it down, either killing it or making it weaker until we do kill it. And then for 1 mana until your next turn, Volrath the Shape Stealer becomes a copy of target creature with a counter on it, except it's a 7/5 and it has this ability. Maybe we want to make a copy of one of our great creatures that does doubling of any kind, or who knows what. This is going to be able to do that, and very, very powerful and cool effect, especially because we're just putting counters on everything. But what do you think? Is proliferating and +1/+1 counters the way this deck should be built? Is there another strategy around this? You know, I would love to see what you think in the comments down below. So thank you for watching. If you would consider subscribing, this is the final video of this series, but I do commander decks. I do all kinds of other videos talking about rule mechanics. I talk about other interesting things about, you know, what's going on in Magic World, set spoilers, all that sort of stuff. So if you are new to my channel or have been watching forever, thank you for doing so. Thank you for helping me get this far. You know, like I said in a couple of these other ones, I'm trying to hit 1,500 subscribers by the end of the year. So if you would consider subscribing and maybe sharing this video with a friend and leaving a like, helping me grow would just mean the world to me. So thank you so much. And today's Scryfall card of the day is Oron Reef Survivalist. I am strong enough to survive alone. I am smart enough to want companions at my side. Thank you so much for watching. And as always, I'll see you later, Planeswalkers.